Welcome back.
We're back.
How are you doing?
Amazing. I am sitting at a desk that is covered in 11 different beverages. So it's been a good day.
As usual, I see a Never Second gel
Yep.
ready in case you start bonking.
Correct. You never know.
You never know. I may bonk.
We pod so hard. Like, I'm fully at threshold at all times.
What flavor is that over there?
This is berry.
Berry?
So,
Tastes like Robitussin.
I don't taste it.
You don't taste that Robitussin flavor?
Yeah. I actually have been enjoying the Never Second gels lately, and especially that there are so many flavors.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you which flavor is which. They all just kind of taste like gel. I'm not saying any flavor is particularly good, but you can mix up a lot of really mediocre flavors, and that's exciting.
I think they're good. You know, I have gotten on that SIS train.
I noticed that you've been experimenting with SIS.
And I've made a sizable investment.
Yeah.
In those gels recently, and I would say they are the gel that goes down the fastest. I don't know if it's the way that the packaging is shaped.
Yeah.
But they go down so fast that you don't have to think about it. And I kind of like that. And so I'm leaning a little more towards those right now, although I don't have one with me right now. They're so important to me that I only use them in my long runs, not during my work day.
Wow, you're rationing.
Rationing.
Yeah.
I need to make sure I have enough for the race coming up in a month.
I need to spend another $1 billion on gels for my long run.
The downside to high carb fueling is it is very expensive.
But what is the price of not feeling like shit?
I would pay almost any amount to feel good and to recover well and to be injury free.
Pretty worth it. I mean, it's annoying. Like, when you actually have to click the buttons and you're like, great, like, that long run is literally like the cost of a massage. My hobby is so stupid and terrible.
How good would a massage be?
I could go see a movie and get a facial for the cost of my weekend in training. I wish that was not true. But on the other hand, I love not having a bone stress injury, and I love being able to run for 4 hours.
The things we do with our limited spare time.
With our limited time and money.
It's almost like we love to do it.
It's almost like we have nothing better to do with our one wild and precious life.
So we want to support other people in doing this with their wild and precious lives in time. So what do we have in store to help people out with their self-coaching?
First thing that I want to flag is that we are out of Hot or Nots, which is where TJ and I attempt to give hot takes, but almost always spend 20 to 30 minutes talking about the nuances because we are dispositionally incapable of giving a hot take about almost anything.
Gosh.
So send us your ideas, microcosmcoaching@gmail.com.
Yes.
What do you think what do you want us to, like, is something overrated, underrated, correctly rated? Let us know what you want us to rate.
I would love to get some emails on this.
Yeah, we need to get some new ones. Otherwise, I'm just going to treat you to my 17-minute stand-up special, which you do not want. But today, what we are going to do is answer a listener question, and then we're going to talk about a study that honestly kind of shocked me.
Yeah,
I was very surprised by this. It's making me question everything.
It does. It is. Okay, I'm not sure. I don't have fully formed thoughts on this because it's so interesting. So I can't wait to get into it.
Yes. So hopefully that's a teaser for you.
Yep.
Great. Well, here's the listener question. Okay. I'm going to float it by you, TJ, and then I'll get your gut check. Hey team, I've been noticing that on my long runs, my heart rate starts out pretty steady, but by the last few miles, it creeps way up, even when I'm keeping the same pace and effort. Is that normal? What do you think is causing it, and is there anything I can do to keep it from happening?
Woo! Cardiac drift.
Cardiac drift.
Yes. I love this question, actually, because this happens to pretty much everybody. And it is very normal. It's very common, and it's just good to recognize that in your training because it can ask you to make a self-inquiry about, hey, what are the causes of this? Why does it happen? And what can I do about it?
Yeah, so this is one of the primary metrics that with my athletes, I make a habit of always checking on their long runs. I always look at their cardiac drift, also known as cardiac coupling. And what that means is your heart rate creeps up over the course of a long run, even if your pace or effort stays the same. So it's kind of like your body's way of saying like, whoa, I'm working way harder now to do the same thing I was doing an hour ago. And that's one of the primary things that I always like to keep an eye on with athletes. The challenge with that data piece is basically like for me, if I have in Training Peaks, if I identify that my athlete has a cardiac drift of above 5%, I'm going to say, hey, I noticed you had cardiac drift. This could be for one of like 20 reasons. Let's talk about it.
Right.
Because it's hard to identify exactly, like the causes are multifactorial, so it's hard to identify exactly what it is. So I would say like one of the bigger culprits of cardiac drift is if someone is new to running. Like obviously, like the more habituated you get to aerobic training, the less strain that additional mileage is going to put on your body relative to if you are lesser trained. So if you're newer to runs, you're like just getting comfortable with like 90 plus minute runs, probably a bit normal to see some of that cardiac drift. But also we really want to try to help it by making sure you're fueling well, hydrating well, you're not pacing like a dumbass, and you're not like, you're not allowing your effort to creep up either. So,
well, I think that brings us into some of the main causes of this, right?
Yeah.
So, dehydration
Yep.
and blood volume loss are two causes. As you sweat, your plasma volume drops, and it makes your heart pump faster to maintain the same output levels. So even mild dehydration can actually cause a noticeable increase in heart rate. And then also fuel depletion is really, really important to recognize here. If you're doing a long run and you're not replacing lost glycogen stores, then your body is going to be shifting into trying to burn more fat.
Don't love that.
Not as efficient, and it has to work harder to do that. It requires more oxygen. Your heart rate's going to increase. So, this kind of fueling factor, I think, is really, really, really important to recognize. And then also the blood volume loss, you can kind of look at that also in terms of core temperature rising. Yeah. So as you increase your training load, your body starts to get warmer, your core temperature goes up.
The longer you're out there running.
Yeah, exactly. As that load increases, as you're out there running for longer durations, you start to heat up, and what happens is your body diverts blood flow to the skin to help with evaporative cooling, to keep you cool, get that heat out.
It's like, oh my God, this blood is hot. Let's get it closer to the cool air.
Yes, exactly. And so you have less blood available for your working muscles, which forces the heart to work harder.
That's tough.
Raises your heart rate. And then obviously we were just talking about this. It's a fitness factor too. Mm-hmm. So if you're not as fit, fatigue increases much more quickly over the course of these runs. So it becomes harder to maintain the same output for the same heart rate. And so your heart rate goes up, and so it drifts. And then also, efficiency is kind of, I think, in there with that fitness and fatigue. So athletes who are more efficient, they can run faster at a lower heart rate than athletes who are less efficient. And so that the cost is higher per stride, essentially. And then the more fatigued and the less efficient you are, that cost kind of is amplified.
Yes.
Each stride takes even more energy, and you're already tired, so you're really focused on it, heart rate goes up.
And this sort of goes back to our overarching philosophy around a relationship to data, which is that we love it up and until the point that we don't love it, which is to say that, again, like once I've identified that an athlete has cardiac drift, it could be for any number of these reasons, and it's always tough or it can be tough to figure out exactly why. Like, this is a data point that gives us more questions than answers, but I think that's a helpful way to view not only this data point, but many, many others. So let's talk about ways to combat that cardiac drift.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Thing number one, hydrate properly. Do a fluid test, do an electrolyte test. Figure out how much fluid you need to take in per hour to restore 70 to 90% of the fluid you lose per hour while running. So before and during long runs, Make sure that you're hydrating enough and you're taking in electrolytes to help retain that plasma volume. Let's keep that blood volume banging.
I think that's so key. And something that I was just kind of thinking about in the context of this, Zoe, is that when you have like a specific athlete who you know well, you've been coaching them for a while, you're noticing that drift. I feel like you can kind of funnel into kind of some of those causes and see what that cause and effect is. Like if you've got an athlete who's quite fit, they've been training with you for a number of years, they've done these distances before, and you're noticing that cardiac stroke, then, okay, well, was it really warm out there? Or, okay, how is your hydration and fueling? Have you been fueling to your potential? Like you can go into those things, and then we can go to what can we deal, how can we deal with it? What do we do about it to prevent this on the next run? Because I think the worst thing in situations like this is with that increase in heart rate, actually there is like an RPE rise that occurs. Like it just feels harder to maintain those effort levels. And so then you have to go even slower to kind of make it still feel like an easy run. And then that stresses out a lot of athletes. They feel, I'm not fit, I'm not doing it right, something's wrong here.
And that's why, again, this data point should prompt us to ask more questions than like, I never just like reach out to an athlete. I'm like, hey, great news, you're out of shape.
You don't look fit.
Yeah, great news, I looked at your data and you're a piece of shit. No one I coach is a piece of shit. They're all very lovely and in excellent condition. So, and especially like, I think one of the complexities here, again, understanding that this data point necessarily depends on heart rate data. If you're using heart rate data from your watch, congratulations, let yourself off the hook. That is garbage data. If you are, by happenstance, using a arm strap or a chest strap, congratulations, you have somewhat more serviceable data, but it always still has to be taken with a grain of salt. Again, knowing that, like, if it is related to heat, like, yes, likely your RPE will creep up along with your cardiac, with that cardiac drift.
Yeah.
If it's something like hydration or caffeination, your RPE may or may not change in relationship to that cardiac drift.
Actually, a really interesting question that I have for you,
Yes.
maybe you know the answer to this because I don't know the answer. If you consume caffeine in run, can that increase heart rate in run?
It absolutely can.
Interesting. Yep. I would think that would be the answer.
Yeah.
But I've never like looked at that for myself because I don't
caffeine,
ever look at heart rate.
Medication, all of that. I mean, again, like if you're taking in enough caffeine that it measurably changes your heart rate, that is too much caffeine. That's not what you want. So don't do that.
Reminds me of Rio del Lago.
Where I was like eating 4 caffeinated gels an hour.
For 19 hours.
For 19 hours. I did not sleep that night.
Yeah, I think your heart rate was effed for multiple days.
Which like it definitely, after running 100 miles, your resting heart rate is like
high. Mine
was like 69 for several days, which is incredible.
It's your favorite number.
It's my lucky number. Tied for first place with 420, which if your heart rate is 420, you have died, which is tough. Your heart exploded. So like, again, like there are things that can change your heart rate that might not change your RPE, but the most dangerous thing is when it changes both your heart rate and your RPE in a way that like, and we don't know why. So that's always where it should prompt examination. So, some amount of aerobic decoupling is normal, but if you start to see major drift, again, like on Training Peaks, if you're looking at the stat, it's the HR:P or NAPR. There's a colon in it. And it gives you a percentage. If it's more than 5% positive, that's when I'm usually like, hey, what's going on here?
Right.
And that could mean you need to dial in your hydration, your fueling. We need to do more aerobic base training. You need to get a little more specific with your pacing. It also could mean that you ended the run on an uphill. So again, all of this with a big grain of salt. Yeah, and occasionally like I'll see an athlete that has like a really like a crazy low like rate of aerobic decoupling through, the Training Peaks, and again, usually that's like relative to like, oh, you finished on a technical trail, you finished on a downhill. Awesome. Like it's always, always, always as a coach, our job to plumb the deeper story and never be like, hey, athlete, you're out of shape or you're dehydrated. I'm always like, hey, I noticed this data point. It can mean any of these things. What resonates with you? What was your RPE? How do you feel? And occasionally an athlete would be like, actually, I felt like my effort level was totally consistent. I nailed my fueling. Really don't know. And great, we've just had a productive and positive conversation about how good you are at fueling, hydrating, and pacing. So always productive in my book.
Yeah, boxes checked.
Boxes checked.
Nice.
Cool. Do you want to talk about this study that is rocking our worlds?
So, a detailed summary of maintaining physical performance, the minimal dose of exercise needed to preserve endurance and strength over time. I like this study because, man, does it shed some light on what you need to do to maintain your fitness. And I think it will help ease a lot of athletes' anxieties when they're dealing with injury, when they're dealing with life's happenings that might prevent them from doing some consistent training, and also with recovery after big events.
Yeah.
So I don't want to have any spoiler alerts, but the study analyzes research that categorizes endurance and strength training based on three main variables: frequency, volume, and intensity. And it examines how adjustments to each factor affects performance maintenance.
So here's why we are geeking out about this study. So researchers took a deep dive into essentially what is the least amount of training you can get away with while still, while engaging in maintenance, while maintaining
what you've worked hard to get.
Maintaining what you came into the study with, which is kind of a bold objective, because so much of studying is how do we get better? And this study bravely asks the question, how do you not get worse? Love that. Thank you, science.
That is fun.
So these researchers pulled together studies where athletes followed a structured training plan for several weeks and then cut back on either frequency, volume, or intensity, not all three, because again, science variables only can tweak one, for an extended period. Performance markers like VO2 max, muscle strength, and endurance capacity were measured before and after the training reduction to see what actually stuck around and what fell off. The goal here was to figure out what is the bare minimum you need to do to keep your fitness intact, which is exciting. Again, as coaches, our goal is usually not the bare minimum. Usually we are what is the least you can do while still progressing?
Right, while still provoking adaptation.
While still provoking adaptation. How do we get you from where you are now to where you want to go? And I think it's actually helpful to look at the research on how do we keep you the same, because unfortunately the fact of being a human and living a human life means that you can't always be doing the most and getting better. And there will be circumstances where knowing how little you can do is actually very helpful.
I think so, because I don't know, think about how many times in the 7 years that Microcosm's been a coaching organization that we've had athletes leave the program because they don't feel like they can do enough training because of the context of their life has changed. Right. And usually when the context of our lives change, it's not a permanent thing, but we jump to this conclusion that where we're at now is permanent. It's going to last forever because we're dealing with a challenge, a big change that's hard to wrap our heads around it in the moment. And so we think, okay, I got to let all of these things go. And sometime in the future, I don't know when, well, then I'll rebuild. And it's well, based on this study, which we'll get into, you can actually do a lot less.
Yep.
You can really take the pressure off of yourself and keep yourself all of that stuff that you work so hard to maintain for so many months. You can actually keep a relatively high level without doing a whole lot.
Yeah. I will say this sort of hit me right in the feels, because coming off of our boot camp last week, I ran a 96-mile week or whatever, and then our coach built in some recovery, and then this week I was working in Zion National Park for doing some writing, and I did not have time to do 10 hours of running while I was there. I had my toxic trait as a athlete, and I'm so sorry to all of my coaches and honestly just anyone in my life. I imagine that I'm always going to be able to do the most, and that rarely happens. That's really unfortunate about how my brain works. But
well, I think like it's good to. I think that there's like a line there because
I'm an optimist.
It's very good to like want to have the quote unquote ideal amount of training or to do what your coach prescribes because like clearly no training is prescribed without very legitimate intention and reasonality behind it. But there's also, and as a high performing person, most high performing people look at that schedule and they're like, I'm going to do as much of this as humanly possible because that's going to get me the results that I want. That's going to get me the growth that I want to get to where I want to go. So, it's not debatable.
Or potentially it's a security blanket that wallpapers over other stuff they are navigating in the context of their life.
I mean, inflexibility would probably be a sign of that. So you can like want to pursue the highest amount of the training that you can get in that's prescribed. And then there's another thing about like, okay, life is happening. I can't like adjust to that. I'm having real problems adjusting.
Right.
That would say something about that.
Yeah, correct.
But, and not to get sidetracked here, I do have a point to this. When we have a week like that, we all think, I got to do all of this to get to where I want to go. But the study shows that actually, like, if you have 1 week of this, you're going to be the same person you were like the next week. You're the exact same.
Yeah.
And that, I think, at least for me, like information like that can help me loosen my grip and navigate the nuances of like what actually happens in the week to week, month to month process of training long term.
Yeah.
Much more easily because with that evidence, then like with that research and the evidence there, you can then rationalize with yourself like the reasoning why it's okay to not have the highest outcome in training right now.
Correct. And I actually think, especially for the type of, folks that we tend to work with who are really hardworking, motivated people, like as a group, people like don't struggle that much with motivation. People tend to struggle more with overdoing it and always thinking they need to do more. And I think that this study presents a rational case for, actually, like if you are that athlete who runs when they're sick, don't fucking do that. If you are that athlete that runs when they're hurt, don't fucking do that. If you're that athlete that runs on rest days, don't fucking do that.
Right.
Because again, I was really shocked as a coach at apparently how little training you need to do
to maintain where you're at.
Which is not our usual program.
Yeah, it's not. It's like, clearly it's not.
People aren't like, I want to pay you, my hard-earned money so that I can stay exactly the same. We're not Botox. That's not our goal.
But there are times in the year, and we could probably, why don't we just talk about that now before we go into the exact findings of this study? But there are times of the year where staying the same would be freaking amazing.
Yeah.
Like, for example, you just BQ'd your marathon, you just BQ'd, and now you train for 16 weeks super hard to get that result, and now you're feeling pretty exhausted by all that. You had the race, and you need to rest, and you need to give yourself that opportunity. Well, my fitness can stay the same if I do X, Y, and Z, and just stick to this formula. The research suggests, well, my fitness won't decrease, so I don't need to rush back. Or like that classic case of like the athlete who loves to do a million different races a season.
Yep.
And it's like one after the other.
And they panic train between the races.
Yeah. It's
because they're worried about losing fitness, even though their CK levels are still astronomical.
Right. And it's just like, you actually can probably just rest and do the minimum amount to maintain what you built, and then do the next race.
Right, which through risk-benefit analysis, it's always maintaining is sort of, that's a neutral outcome, but typically, I don't know, if you have 250 milers pretty close together, you're not going to be able to build fitness in the intermediary. Like, you are in a harm reduction mode.
No, but how many times have you seen an athlete
every time
rush back
all the times
really fast, try to force some workouts, try to force some long runs, and then end up that second race feeling like garbage? Maybe they get injured. Mentally they weren't ready because they didn't give them enough time to recover mentally. That's a story as old as time in endurance sports in general, not just in trail running, I think, but probably more predominant in trail running. You don't typically see a lot of marathon runners do like 4 BQ attempts inside of 6 months.
So
that's like a real trail runner thing.
Like, when we're good friends with Peter Bromka, who's a coach and an elite marathoner, and he's always like, you guys are fucking crazy. Like, I will run a marathon and I'm not doing workouts for like a month and a half. Like, I am resting for 10 days. And like, he's like, why are you guys running 100 miles? And then like trying to, like, not to us specifically, but to trail runners, because our culture has some, I think some toxic / not exactly evidence-based narratives around how and why and when you should get back to training after having run. I mean, honestly, even like an ultra, you know?
Well, totally. And like, the training is a blanket we put over our insecurity. And if we can train, we feel like we're enough. We're doing something that's going to get us closer to where we want to go. And we don't recognize that rest does the same thing. And because rest is something we view as not like action forward.
Right.
This keeps me where I am. And so, like, well, in a lot of cases, like, it'd be best if you just stayed where you were because you're doing something crazy in a couple more weeks. Like, running an ultra, man, running a marathon, if you really think about it, is pretty
really fucking
crazy.
hard. Yeah, it's crazy.
Any of these things are crazy.
Yes.
So I think the more research that we have that supports, 1, minimum effective dose to produce outcomes. 2, minimum dose to maintain performance levels, especially during recovery periods of prolonged illness or life stress.
Yeah.
That is going to help athletes feel more secure. So that way, when they don't feel like they're doing enough, that they're not doing something that's active enough that's going to lead them to where they want to go.
We can combat that with science.
With real evidence, because like, in order to adjust your thinking and your beliefs around things, you need to develop more truths. Even better if those things are based in actual evidence and research.
Ideally, truth should be based in evidence and research.
Well, if we know from anything in culture right now and anything in the reality of how the human brain works, we can develop a truth and say it's a truth out of freaking anything.
Not at Microcosm Coaching. At Microcosm Coaching, we know that Ukraine didn't start the war and that there is a minimum effective dose for training. So, just gonna say it. So let's talk a little bit about.
Are you sure?
I'm a fucking journalist. I used to be a professional fact checker. Like,
my gosh,
this is my shit. So let's talk about the effect of reduced training frequency.
Yes.
So endurance training. So when endurance training is reduced to 2 sessions per week, athletes can maintain performance levels.
That is absolutely mind-boggling.
I have never done that for an athlete.
No.
That's really helpful for me to hear. Again, that's not the ideal.
I have issues with this.
I have issues, again, like, I think that what you will hear us do in real time is wrestle with how to bring this evidence, how and where and why it can impact our praxis or what we do on the ground today. Because it is never good to see one study and be like, great, I'm going to change everything I do starting tomorrow. It is also not good to see one study and say, great, this doesn't support how I've been doing things, so I'm going to ignore it. So you will hear us updating our practice in real time, and hopefully that humility and openness to emerging evidence encourages everyone to not be an asshat. So, and then strength training. So a reduction in strength training frequency to 1 session per week can maintain or even increase strength in younger athletes. So that's in like folks in their 20s. For older athletes, again, because of the sort of like the physiological changes that athletes undergo as they age. So folks 40, 50, 60 years and older, 2 strength sessions per week may be necessary to effectively maintain muscle size and strength.
I was disappointed by this finding.
Yeah,
that I'm gonna
because you're one and done for the week.
It's just, who's got time?
You play guitar for like 8 hours a day.
I really care about being excellent at
I care about having an excellent booty.
I can't believe that I'm going
to
need to do 2 strength sessions to maintain.
I know, it's upsetting.
Oh, wait, hold on. We glossed over what happens if you reduce frequency to 1 session of running a week.
So if you reduce your running frequency to 1 run per week, you will see a decline in performance. Missing more than 1 session per week increases the chances of significant fitness loss.
So can you explain that one point to me? Because I didn't quite understand this. Is it more like if you miss 1 session, you're more likely to miss 2 or 3 sessions and therefore you're gonna lose fitness as a result? Or if it's like, because if it's like, if you miss 1 session, you will see a decline in performance, but missing more than 1 session per week increases the chance of significant fitness loss. Like
that, what you said.
Okay.
Yeah.
So missing more than 1 session.
Yep.
So if I have 5 sessions and I go down to 4, that increases my chances of significant fitness loss.
Correct. Yeah.
So missing any sessions does increase your risk for fitness loss.
It does increase your risk for fitness loss when you reduce training chronically.
Yes.
If you miss, what you should not hear right now is that if you miss 1 day of training this week, your fitness is gone. That is not what's happening. This is talking about chronic load. So here's the takeaway that I want athletes to walk away with. If you can manage 2 endurance sessions and 1 strength session per week, you can keep your fitness levels intact according to the study.
Oh my gosh.
Anything lower than that, like if you're only doing 1 training, like if you're only running once a week, which like, I mean, dear God, like
things have got to be really wrong.
Things have got to be really tough.
Do 1 run a week.
That's where, and like also one of the complexities there is that like when you spread out your training volume, any one experience of stress is slightly less stressful on the aggregate.
And
when you're only running once a week, like if you just do 10 miles once a week, that is way less productive and way harder on your body than doing 2 miles 5 times a week.
And you have to think also, like, what is the perception of our fitness loss because of how much efficiency we lose by not
reinforcing that,
doing this on a consistent basis. Then we don't use the neural pathways and we feel very slow. And I think a lot of times something that happens with athletes, and you've probably seen this in your coaching, is that an athlete, gets sick or they get an injury and they're out for a week, they're out for 2 weeks, and they get back. And we as coaches know, like, you need 2 weeks of no activity to really start to see like significant decreases.
Yeah, it takes 14 days of no activity to start physiologically seeing detraining.
Right. So like we know if an athlete doesn't run for 2 weeks, their fitness is actually pretty much the same as it was 2 weeks ago, but they feel worse. My thesis around that is, well, that is my hypothesis is that that's because they're not running frequently, so it's a loss of efficiency.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. You're correct when you're not getting that neuromuscular reinforcement. Like you are going to feel clunkier. Like oftentimes, coming back from a race, coming back from a sickness, those first couple runs can kind of feel like, whoa, I've got little Bambi legs.
Yeah.
Or like I tend to feel pretty sluggish. So if you're not running and exercising, your blood volume will drop, and that can a lot of times lead to a feeling of like, well, I just rested. Why don't I feel really energized?
Fresh.
You can also feel a little fatigued or sluggish and feel like a bit flat when your blood volume drops. So that can be another part of it too. So let's talk about the effect of reduced training volume. So thinking of this, so instead of looking just at frequency, we're talking about volume as a concept now. So endurance training. Reducing your volume by 33 to 50% while keeping the frequency and intensity the same allows athletes to maintain their endurance for up to 15 weeks.
So if you were running 100 miles a week and you reduced to 70 miles a week, you would be able to, for 15 weeks, maintain that same level of fitness.
Assuming you're doing the same number of runs and the same number of workouts.
That's pretty nice to hear.
Yeah, again,
I like that.
I think this complicates or adds nuance to the previous section that we discussed because again, like knowing that frequency is a big factor here, right?
Right.
Like that is like, if you're, again, like most people are not running 100 miles a week, but if you are, and then you can only run because I'm bad at math,
it's just
50 miles a week, you should still be aiming to run approximately the same number of days. Like going from 6 days a week of running to 2 and still having that 50% drop will be worse for you. So I know like this is one of the tough things to contextualize when people are reducing training volume because of like life circumstances. But I also hope that it opens up more room for like short runs are great. Like every mile counts. Like just because you can't get out for your 5 miles or your 10 miles or whatever, like your hour, your 2 hours, however you're thinking about your training, like keeping up that frequency is helpful and important.
And the intensity also is another factor that's important to this.
Intensity was held the same to preserve that 15-week window.
And we'll talk about that, why that's important when we talk about VO2 max. But it's that intensity, it does need to be part of the training still. And you need to find a way to work that in if you want to take this approach.
Correct. And the study found that reducing volume by more than 50% will start to have a much more noticeable negative effect on endurance capacity. So while some losses are inevitable, keeping the training sessions at the same intensity will make a big difference.
How about for strength?
Yeah, so for strength training, for strength maintenance, it's been found that performing only 1 set per exercise with 1 session per week is enough to maintain strength, even for 32 weeks.
Yeah, let's go.
TJ, rejoice. TJ's lazy booty. He's so happy over here.
This is perfect. This is exactly what I've been doing for the last 6 weeks.
I am looking for science that tells me I do not need to modify my behavior. Please and thank you. So again, for older folks, masters, athletes, 2 to 3 sets per, again, sorry, TJ. You're getting into that age group.
No, I'm 28 still.
You're not 28. You have gray hairs. You have little gray hair. You have gray mustache hairs now.
That's normal. It's normal. I don't run my own business and have a lot of stress in my life.
For older adults, you need to sort of look for 2 to 3 sets per exercise with 2 sessions per week, more effective for maintaining that muscle size. So the takeaway when we're thinking about volume is that cutting your training volume by up to half while maintaining the same intensity will help you preserve fitness for a long period of time. If you reduce the intensity, the losses will be greater.
So before we move on here, let's just talk about what I think is the more ideal scenario for athletes who want to maintain for any various reasons.
Right.
I think it's important to go to this volume approach of being within 33 to 50% while maintaining the frequency and the intensity. That is something that I think is really critical, especially for runners, because it's so neuromuscular. If you drop the frequency, you feel so much worse. And there's also a lot of loading that happens when you're running. So if you drop the frequency, it can take time to develop the durability again.
Right.
I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but this is something that I've certainly noticed and heard from with athletes, is that like athletes who take a few weeks off because of injury, their legs get sore very quickly after runs.
Yeah, and that's always something that like we're always, the way that we start to re-implement intensity, like always starting with hill strides, then moving to flat strides, or however, like uphill intensity, is because you have to essentially like retrain the bones and gristle to take on that load. And again, this study is not measuring that specifically. It's specifically looking more at like indicators of fitness, but again, to complicate all of this, we have to take into context, like, I mean, I've had athletes, like, they're like, I'm taking a 2-week cruise, I'm not going to run. They come back, they go balls to the wall in their first run, and they pull a muscle because their muscles have not been doing anything for, like, 2 weeks. So, like, stuff like that, like, just, like, quitting cold turkey for reasons that are in your control. If it's injury, like, yes, quit cold turkey. Sickness, yes, quit cold turkey. But like to the extent that you can still keep up some amount of running, that will help minimize the risk of injury coming back, which is why like after longer injuries, we always start with like a walk run, then like slowly introducing and then building running volume, then back-to-backs, then slowly reintroducing in intensity. Because, again, it takes longer for the soft and hard tissue to catch up with the aerobic engine.
If you had your pick and you could always operate with any athlete under, in the most ideal conditions, which scenario would you go to? Would you go to the volume and keep the frequency intensity the same, or would you reduce?
Yeah, I think often, though, the thing that's tough, like reflecting on how I feel like this shows up in my coaching, living in Colorado, we have a lot of athletes that ski a lot. And so one of the challenges and really, like, I am passionate about supporting people's full athletic selves. And I do not believe in saying, sorry, hang up your skis, you need to jog all winter. So it's that balance of like, there is always a trade-off there, and knowing like, okay, how can we keep that frequency up? Like, if you don't want to do long runs on the weekend, what can we do during the week to, again, it's not ever going to be the same stimulus, but what can we do? What other stimulus can we explore? And if people want to drop their running volume because they want to get more into skiing or biking or whatever it is, helping educate the athlete about the trade-offs around some of these things. And again, like if you're cross-training, it's not the exact same thing as doing it's very much not the same thing as doing nothing. Pretty evident. So again, this is all more complicated, but I feel like the way this often shows up in my coaching is like during the winter, people want to ski more and run less. I think that's always a tough balance.
Yeah, I think that's a good, that's just a good take. Like I hadn't even, right. Like, of course, like what about our multi-sport athletes? What about our athletes who like to bike as well as run, who participate in skimo and run, who just want to downhill ski and run, who, I don't know, through hike and run. I mean, there's just so many different combinations, right? How do we use this in certain seasons to influence maintain the systems approach?
What I'm hearing, in the way that I would use some of this evidence to update my practice, is to continue to put emphasis on frequency, even if that means like, hey, like get a 30-minute run after your ski day, like to the extent that you can and it's safe. And like, if you've been skiing for 15 hours, no, don't go jog, within reason. Right. And like, this is why you have a coach to help it make sense for your life and your skiing and your specific situation. But trying to not have these huge gaps where frequency just tanks. Because that's where it looks like things really start to like go off the rails fitness wise.
So let's talk about the effect of reduced training intensity.
Yeah, so even for endurance training, we all know that intensity is crucial. So reducing your volume and frequency is manageable, but if intensity drops, your VO2 max, which is that key indicator of endurance and fitness, starts to decline very quickly. So this was one that I think is pretty in line with what we already practice, but I think, again, really brings home the importance of like reinforcing that top end. So maintaining high intensity sessions, even at a reduced volume or frequency, will help preserve aerobic fitness and prevent a drastic decline in endurance performance. And so what this looks like for me in practice is helping reinforce with athletes, especially if someone feels like they need to take like a step back in their training. I always want to work with them on finding a happy medium of like, okay, what would it look like to take some pressure off, to help you feel a bit freer to make autonomous decisions in your training, because sometimes athletes feel like things like the strides or the hills, like that feels like a pressure on them, that feels like a structure that is like
do that's more work.
That's more work. And what this tells us is that like it is just not, you cannot say we can drop intensity and expect the same results. So I think that again, it comes back to like educating the athlete around the trade-offs of like, well, if doing any amount of intensity is just absolutely bugging you and makes you feel like you're going to burn out, that's one thing. But how can we maybe find a happy medium? Because I cannot honestly look you in the eyes and say that going out and running loosey-goosey and however you feel is going to get you the same end, because it is not. So how can we find a way of like finding that balance between where do we have some give, where on that frequency or that on that overall volume, do we maybe have some give? And how can we still work in that top end reinforcement? Because this was the thing that like declined much more rapidly than anything else.
And that is tough because that lowers your ceiling, so that lowers the possibility for growth later.
Right.
So if you lose that ceiling, then you do have to rebuild that ceiling in order to have the space to build the aerobic system. I'm curious if I'm curious because I only looked at the summary of this study, if they talk a little bit about the particular intervention they were using to maintain a percentage of that VO2 max and what the structure of those workouts looked like and the frequency of those workouts.
That is in the methodology section of this paper, but I unfortunately haven't memorized it.
Okay, yes, I do want to look at that later. I think that'd be really cool.
For folks at home who are interested, the study is maintaining physical performance, the minimal dose of exercise needed to preserve endurance and strength over time. And I will link to it in the show notes so that you too can look at the specific training interventions that you're using.
Like if you're a self-coached athlete, or even for coaches who might be listening to this, like, oh, that could give an idea of like, what kind of workout should I be, assigning to athletes to get the minimum dose?
Yeah, I think even more importantly, it's the framework, though, right? Because, like, how do we apply the broad, because it's not assessing the impact of specific workouts. That wasn't the study design.
But it's assessing whether or not a certain percentage of their VO2 max is maintained.
Right.
So, like, what kind of work specifically do we need to do to maintain?
Were they not doing?
Or were they not? Right. Like, is it hill strides, or do we have to do VO2 max specific work, 1-to-1 ratio? Like,
but I think the overarching principle, though, that they point to, and the way that they even talk about it in the conclusion of the study, is like they're not like, and you must do 5 by 20-second hills.
Right.
They're just saying like you need to get
intensity.
Your heart rate up. Yes.
Yeah.
Correct. So like they do specify what the workouts are, but they did not point to the specific workouts as being what was key to either the maintenance or the reduction.
Sure. I do think, last point on this, the structure of those workouts, like in terms of work and rest duration, could tell you something about what you might want to do as a coach.
Right.
All right. Strength training. Intensity of strength training? People do intense strength training? Talk to me about this.
So, I mean, this is not how I coach people on strength, and this is sort of where I think it's worth mentioning, like, this was done in the study, but this is not something I think that we need to harp on much. So,
sure.
Reducing your intensity, and I didn't even write down exactly how they quantified it, or reducing it to 50% of maximal voluntary contraction MVC leads to significant loss. So if I'm interpreting this as being, if you drop your weights by half, you're gonna lose strength.
Makes sense.
So to maintain muscle strength, athletes need to engage in maximal or near maximal contractions. Anything less than that will fail to preserve strength. So if you usually use 10-pound weights, picking up the 3-pound weights is not going to yield maintenance.
Yeah.
So here is like where things really not really diverge. What we see is that, like, for strength, you don't need to hammer in the gym 5 days a week, but you do need to hammer in the gym 1 day a week.
Yeah, with the same weight.
Correct. So if you're forced to reduce training, maintaining intensity is the most important factor for preserving both endurance and strength. So cutting volume or frequency is acceptable, and the margins for error there are significantly larger, but not when it comes to reducing intensity. That's where you start to see the biggest compromises on your fitness. And this is tough because I feel like for athletes, oftentimes the first thing they want to get rid of is that intensity because it's hard.
Yeah, because it's uncomfortable, but it's kind of one of the most important things.
It's kind of the whole thing.
All right. We already kind of talked a little bit about some takeaways, but let's just quickly hit some bullet points here for people and summarize that.
Yeah, so if you need to train less for something like injury, illness, off-season, you just had a baby, prioritize intensity over volume and frequency. So for endurance, aim for at least 2 endurance sessions per week at the usual intensity and duration. For strength, aim for at least 1 strength session per week, ideally maintaining intensity. Use the same weights. If you can't hit the normal durations due to time constraints, weather, or injury, cut workout time by 1/3 to 1/2, but keep the intensity at its regular level. So you can shorten the warm-up or the cool-down for your workout, but if you don't have time, the worst thing you can do is say, fuck the workout, I'm doing a recovery run.
Yeah.
Don't increase your frequency to make up for the lost volume. It's likely to hinder recovery more than help performance. So another really key point to call out is that complete rest for a week doesn't result in any measurable fitness loss. So you can sit on your butt for a week and we can poke you with all the needles and we will have not a single number that says you have lost fitness. I think that is so important to remember, that the body recovers faster than we think and that you should give it time. Again, I always see athletes who are eager to rush back after an event. They want to rush back after an injury. They're scared they make decisions out of fear of losing fitness rather than an informed decision based on the evidence about, okay, what does positive forward progress look like?
Resting. Yeah. I love it.
TJ loves not running. For a runner, you sure love not doing that.
Okay, I like to get, my 5 days off after a 100 miler. I'm very consistent.
No, I'm making fun of you because you're mentally healthy and it's weird. So, congratulations.
I will say I have been in a relationship with a coach who pushed me to do more than
felt
good after really profoundly hard races where things did not go right. And I think it were just tough situations. And I think, retrospectively, I think that was done out of this fear of well, what if we don't level up on the fitness that you gain from all the training and that experience? It's it's kind of impossible not to level up on that fitness as long as you do something after a week of rest.
Yeah.
If you're doing the minimum dose, which is described here, and you're waiting to recover, your fitness is gonna be there. So there's no rush to force.
I'm choosing to translate this as it is much easier to make the mistake of doing too much too soon. And it is much harder and rarer to make the mistake of, oh no, I didn't do enough after that race.
I think that's a huge takeaway. Yeah, I love that.
So what happens if you stop training entirely? Well, a week off is not going to change your fitness. The only real changes will be that glycogen depletion, so the energy stores in your muscles, and your blood plasma volume. So that is what leads to sort of that temporary sluggishness. Again, those aren't measures of fitness. They just sort of more impact how you're going to feel in those first couple runs back. So fitness loss occurs at a much slower pace than athletes feel and that athletes fear. The real physiological systems that contribute to performance, like VO2 max, strength, endurance, take a long time to degrade. After 2 weeks totally off, again, nothing, nada, no cross training, sitting, all Downton Abbey, your VO2 max might decrease by 4 to 6%.
Really
at the most.
Small.
Your body begins to lose endurance capacity, but your strength is going to remain intact. This is helpful to me because I always get so nervous about missing strength training.
Yeah.
Muscle atrophy or loss of muscle mass begins, but the loss is minor if the break isn't prolonged. Again, this is in that 14-day window. The biggest challenge in this period will be psychological. Athletes often feel sluggish when they return, even though their fitness is still quite solid. So marinate in this truth that how you feel may not, your feelings are valid and you're a wonderful, beautiful snowflake. However, how you feel when you are returning to run oftentimes does not, because we have the science, reflect what is actually happening in your body. You are allowed to say how you feel in your log, and I might send you the PDF of this study for us to both reflect on before we fall asleep at night. And I think that, again, it's true. I always feel oh my God, am I totally out of shape? Am I terrible at running? And no, it's just, again, you're feeling that loss of blood plasma. You're feeling a little bit of that neuromuscular component, but your fitness is not degraded.
Okay, so after those bullet points, how do you feel about not hitting all of your goals for last week's training?
I feel like I can acknowledge that I have a high drive to, check the boxes I'm given. I like to do things right. I think it stems from, thank you for coming to my TED Talk therapy session. I know that I'm an imperfect person, and living my life means making a lot of mistakes, and running oftentimes feels to me, the easiest thing to control because I'm a journalist, I'm a coach, I'm oftentimes dealing with things that are really squirrely and squiggly and nuanced, and running isn't that. It can feel pretty or I experience it in a way that can feel pretty black and white. Did I do my hour-long recovery run? Awesome. Perfect. I am perfect in this one very small, stupid way today, and that is important to me. However, I need to get to a place where I can have an orange box or even a red box on Training Peaks and not feel a lot about that. And because like, again, reading this, like, again, I did literally half the training volume I was assigned last week. I never do that. I'm usually super compliant. I'm super coachable. Life got crazy. I tried to run in like 3 feet of snow at the top of Zion, and that is silly, and I would not recommend that. I literally, so I went into the ranger station at the northern Zion entrance, and I was like, I'm going to do a run. Will I hit snow line? He's like, no, you won't run far enough to hit snow line. 2 miles in, I hit snow line. I was like, I don't know how to tell this man that like I am an elite ultra runner and I'm going to run farther than 2 miles today.
That must have been a fun surprise.
That was pretty shocking to me. It was also shocking that I guess this person looked at me and judged that I wasn't going to go further than 2 miles.
Maybe he had no idea where the snow line was.
We support our park staff. So here's what you can expect.
The one guy who's left at
the
Zion.
The one guy at Zion. He was 100. Thank you, that man. You are really cute and delightful. And he did give me a really good dinner recommendation.
Oh.
So, 1 for 2.
Okay.
Batting 300.
I'll take a good dinner over a good run.
Exactly. Well, I would like to have my cake and eat it too.
Yes.
So after taking 4 weeks totally off, you should expect to see a more noticeable decline. VO2 max could drop by up to 20%. Your strength levels will more gradually decline, especially if you're completely inactive. Your muscle mass might start to shrink, and your neuromuscular function, so how your brain communicates with your muscles, will become less efficient, and that's what leads to that sort of awkward or slow movements when you return to training. And I think, again, the biggest part here for a lot of folks is that psychological state will often get worse as that fitness anxiety kicks in. The fear of losing everything is a big motivator for athletes to get back into training. But again, even after 4 weeks, that's not doing any cross training. That's not doing anything else. Like 20%, it's not ideal, but we can still work with that, baby. That's not that bad.
Yeah. So how fast can we regain our fitness?
So here is where a lot of the good news comes in. After 2 weeks totally off, this study showed that athletes should expect full recovery in about 1 to 2 weeks.
So full return to strength.
Full return to strength, yeah. Like no noticeable changes. After 4 weeks totally off, you should be able to get back to full fitness in about 3 to 5 weeks. And after 8+ weeks off, so here maybe dealing with like a bigger chronic injury, and this is again not factoring in cross training, full recovery could take about 2 months.
So it's 1 to 1.
It's 1 to 1.
That's actually not that bad.
It's really not that bad.
How much time this on paper looks like taking 8 weeks off.
Correct.
Takes 8 weeks to get back to where you were.
Yep. The longer you stop training, the longer it will take to regain your previous fitness levels, but it doesn't take nearly as long as it initially took to build up. So, like, again, if you're at a higher level, like it's so much easier to get back there than it was to get there in the first place, right? Like, I think, like, it took me, like 8-10 years to get where I am. It's not going to take me 8-10 years to get right back there. So...
Unless you take 8 to 10 years
if
off.
and when injury, I need to, go back to Zion and talk to park rangers and, play in the dirt, I can do that. So the big takeaway here is even with a prolonged break, your body will rebuild fitness faster than you initially gained it, especially if you were well trained beforehand. So I think that we should all take a big sigh of relief there. And I think that here is where TJ is really going to come into his own with an appeal to rest.
Rest is not the enemy, my friends and listeners. Rest and recover as much as you need to train productively over time and to accomplish your wildest dreams. Don't fear things like
transition season,
injury recovery, illness-related downtime. Embrace that because you bounce back quickly. The adaptation process is quicker the second time around. When you can't train, it's okay. Don't panic about it. Listen to this podcast, get that information, and let it sink in. You'll get back to full fitness in less time you think, as long as you approach that process to return to run wisely, hopefully with some guidance.
Yeah.
The key is to return gradually, prioritize intensity, and allow the body to recover fully before pushing too hard. And I can't overstate that enough.
Yep.
Like, give yourself time to fully recover. even if it's just like a minor cold or illness that you've had that you're taking time off for, it can easily just come back if you jump into things too quickly because you're overly eager and you're a bit fearful of losing the fitness that you've built. Like, take that extra day. If there's ever a question, like, just take that extra day because it doesn't really mean much in the broader scheme of things.
Yeah, a break isn't the end of your fitness. It's a pause. And with the right approach, you'll be right back to full capacity. So especially if you're like a very motivated athlete, chill the fuck out, do less, do it slower than you think. If you're someone who is listening to this because they're like, I want to see how little I can get away with, congratulations on whatever mental health context allowed you to be there. I would love to get to know you as a friend and continue to reinforce your top end with intensity. You can do a lot less while still maintaining, but again, like there are some complexities here around still reinforcing that top end with intensity and still trying to keep that frequency firing on all cylinders.
Amazing.
Lots to marinate on here.
Yeah, I love it. I'll be thinking about this for a while. Thanks for tuning in, guys. We appreciate having you. Again, if you've made it this far, we would love it if you could rate and review us on your preferred listening platform. Helps people find us. And you can
send us to a friend.
Yeah, send us to a friend. And you can check out our coaching offerings and send us questions. We'd love to hear from you guys. microcosmcoaching@gmail.com, microcosmcoaching.com, microcosmcoaching on Instagram. Have a good one. We'll see you next week.